Góðan daginn, velkomin á enn einn hádegisfyrirlesturinn í þessari hádegisfyrirlestararöð. Félags fornleifafræðinga og námsbrautar fornleifafræði og þjóðminjasafnsins. Í dag ætlum við að hlusta á Elise Mooney segja okkur frá viðargreiningum á við úr oddskumlum. Elise Mooney er nýdoktor í fornleifafræði við Háskóla Íslands og hefur starfaði rannsóknir á íslenskri fornleifafræði árabil og þetta er hluti af þessu verkefni sem við viljum vinna að þér núna. Dawn, gjörðu svo vel.
Hey. Hi, thank you all very much for coming. Just try and get this up and running. So, it's been suggested by a friend of mine that the title I've given for this talk is rather poetic, and I hope that that doesn't give too much of an overstatement of what I'm going to talk about today. What I basically aim to do is to examine the importance of boats in early Icelandic society and their sort of changing meaning and significance throughout their use life through wood remains found in Icelandic boat graves. So, Yep. So apart from rare waterlogged finds such as the boat knee found at Suðurgata, mineral-replaced wood remains from boat burials are pretty much all the direct evidence we have for boat building and repair practices in early Iceland. So today I'm going to outline what evidence we have, how it compares to evidence of boat building from Scandinavia in the Viking Age, and what it can tell us about the origin and use and significance of boats in early Iceland, particularly against the backdrop of limited and diminishing wood resources. So, like most other aspects of early Icelandic culture, the practice of boat burial was imported by the Norse settlers. However, it has its roots much further back than the Viking Age in Scandinavia. The earliest examples of boat graves come from Mesolithic Denmark, for example, the sites of Møllegabet and Vedbeck from the sort of 5th millennium BC, where individuals were interred in dugout canoes. Later on, in Bronze Age Sweden and Denmark, you get these stone ship settings, so rocks that are placed around graves within the shape of a boat. So there's no actual ship there, but the link between boats and the dead still remains. Boat burial, as we know it, or as we're most familiar with it, begins to become more common in the Roman Iron Age of Scandinavia, and the practice is at its peak in the 6th to 10th centuries AD. During this period, boat burials in Scandinavia are widely varied. You get these large, grand, ostentatious graves, such as at Gokstad and Oseberg, and on the other hand, you get very sort of large whole cemeteries, basically, of smaller boat burials, such as at Kaupang and Birka. And the grave goods from these graves show that the practice is not linked to any particular social status or gender or any other social or economic grouping. There have been various suggestions put forward for the precise ritual or religious meaning of this practice, but as that could be the subject of a whole other talk, I'm not going to elaborate too much on that today. Overall, the only common element to all these graves is the boat or the idea of the boat itself, which in the Viking Age tends to be of the clinker-built variety. That is, it's built of overlapping planks held together by metal nails or rivets. So the distribution of boat graves in Scandinavia and Northern Europe is shown on these maps, with the Roman Iron Age examples on the left and the Viking Age examples on the right. These maps are slightly out of date, as many new examples have been found since these maps were produced, but they still show the pattern of locations clearly. They're mostly focused in Scandinavia, with further examples in the British Isles and Iceland, and a single Viking Age example in France. In Iceland, 7 boat graves have been excavated. So there is one at Kaldarhöfði in the south, 2 in the Westfjords at Hringsdalur and Vatnsdalur, 2 at Dalvík in the north, and one at Litlinupar and one at Glumbar in the northeast. Test trenching has also suggested the presence of at least one further example at Kumlabrekka in Mývatnssveit, but this is yet to be fully excavated, so I won't be including it in what I'm talking about today. So the distribution of boat graves across Scandinavia and Northern Europe is essentially a map of the areas of greatest Norse influence, and the Viking ship has quite rightly been referred to as the symbol of the Viking Age. And boats were absolutely essential to transport and contact in Viking Age Scandinavia, and they enabled voyages as far afield as North America and the Near East. It's been suggested that in Scandinavia, shipbuilding was a relatively easy task, as although it required skilled and specialist labour, the raw materials needed, so wool for sailcloth, iron for nails and rivets, and wood for the hull of the boat, were all in plentiful supply. In Iceland, however, the situation is a bit different. The sheep that the settlers brought with them to Iceland could have provided the wool needed for sail production, and although iron was less easily available than in mainland Scandinavia, it could still be smelted from bog ore. Wood, however, was in very short supply compared to the Norse homelands. So we're all familiar with this idea that, or this famous quote that when Iceland was first settled, it was covered with woodland from the mountains to the seashores. And that's not exactly true. We've got issues of topography at play here. For example, the suitability of land for birch woodland varies widely. So some areas are very good areas for woodland growth, whereas others, such as wetlands and glacial outwash plains, are really not conducive to birch growth. But we know from palynological and paleo-environmental studies that at the time of Landnam, around 25 to 40% of the surface area of Iceland was covered with woodland, and that has declined to around 1% in the present day. This is quite regionally variable. It's faster in some areas than others, but it's certainly linked to the activities of the landnámsmenn, for example, grazing, clearance of the woodlands for hay fields, and the use of the wood for construction, for fuel, and for charcoal production. It now seems from paleo-environmental studies that the major decline in Icelandic woodlands comes much later in the island's history, and that some attempts were made in early Iceland to limit the destruction of woodland areas. So while sort of immediate woodland decline might not have been such a problem for early Icelanders in terms of procuring timber, the type of wood available almost certainly was. The settlers came from mainland Scandinavia, where there are dense forests of large trees which would have provided ample timber for construction and carpentry. The native wood species of Iceland are rather different. There are only 9 species present here natively, and only 2 of these grow frequently as large trees. The others are small, low-growing shrubs generally. So although both birch and rowan, these 2 tree forms that we get, can reach large sizes, rowan is only found growing singly in birch woodlands, and so it comprises a very small percentage of the woody biomass of the Icelandic woodlands. The native birch as well has a very kind of twisted and tortuous growth form. It's useful perhaps for roofing timber and for some boat elements where there's a certain form or shape in the wood required, for example, where you need a curved timber. But if you're looking for very long, straight planks, like you use for the strakes of a clinker-built boat, it's not really that useful. However, because there are so few native species in Iceland, it's very easy to identify when wood has arrived otherwise, because this is basically any other wood, apart from these 9 species. Wood was imported both as timber and as ready-made artefacts from Scandinavia and also indirectly from Britain and mainland Europe. There's a wide variety of foreign species found in Icelandic wood assemblages. The most common are oak and Scots pine. The other category we've got to take into account here is driftwood. It's found in large quantities on the Icelandic beaches, especially on the north and west coasts. Now, studies have shown that the Icelandic driftwood is mostly Siberian in origin, coming mainly from the Yenisei River area of central Siberia, and common species found include spruce, larch, white pine, and Scots pine. Spruce and Scots pine are kind of problematic as they both also grow in Scandinavia, so when they're found in archaeological assemblages, they could conceivably be imported. However, larch and white pine are not native to Scandinavia and are therefore almost certainly indicators of driftwood in Icelandic wood assemblages. So in order to determine whether the wood from boats found in Iceland derives from imports or from driftwood timber, we need to understand the wood taxa used in contemporary boats from the rest of the Viking world. So this illustration here is a very rough cross-section of a clinker-built boat, showing the main components and also species identifications of these components from examples from Scandinavia and the British Isles. So oak, which is in black on the pie charts, is clearly the most common. It comprises the majority of strakes or planks and of internal ribs, knees and beams. It also comprises all known examples of keels from Viking Age boats where species identifications have been conducted. Now, oak, we can see from this, is obviously, where it's available, it's the preferred choice. And you get examples, for example, in Ireland, in the Viking towns there, where in sort of domestic carpentry assemblages, you see the use of oak declining. And it's been suggested that this was actually in order to preserve oak simply for use in shipbuilding, and therefore other species such as ash were preferred for house timbers and other day-to-day objects. Other species form a relatively small component of the assemblage, such as ash, alder, lime and beech, which are all well represented. There are others present too. But the other most common find in the Scandinavian and European assemblages is pine. It forms quite a small proportion of the strakes or planks, as you can see at the bottom left there, and is much more common in the internal timbers, such as floor planks, there on the top right. Other conifers are quite rare in these Scandinavian assemblages. Spruce is occasionally identified, but there's no examples of larch known. So the majority of examples of wood that I've given in the previous slide come from the waterlogged remains of boats and ships. But the majority of wood that we have from boat graves does not fall into this category. These remains are actually mineralised. So wood is it's organic matter. It decays very easily, except in certain conditions, for example, where it's waterlogged. However, if there is metal, especially iron, attached to or next to a piece of wood when it's deposited in the ground, for example, in the planks of a clinker-built boat, as the wood decays, the metal also decays. And during this process, corrosion products from the metal can, in the right circumstances, coat the cellular structure of the wood as it decays. Therefore, once the wood is gone, what you're left with is a kind of metal cast of its structure. And this can be examined under a microscope and identified to species, just like waterlogged wood or charcoal. And these kinds of remains make up all the remains of wood from many well-known boat burials, for example, Sutton Hoo in England, Salme in Estonia, and Skar and Ardnamurchan in Scotland. And also all the known wood remains from Icelandic boat burials fall into this category. So the fact that most of our comparative data from the wood used in boat construction in Scandinavia comes from waterlogged finds naturally incurs certain biases. Most of these finds originate from areas of native oak growth, and we know that in these areas oak was preferred for boat building where it was available, but boats were also built in areas where oak did not grow, for example in Western Norway. And the lack of information from these areas may bias the assemblages against the use of other species such as pine. There's also a potential reporting bias. So oak is very much preferred for use in dendrochronological dating. So where taxonomic or species identifications have only been published in relation to dating the ship, then what you see in the assemblage is only the oak components, and the use of other species may be masked. The fact that most wood from boat graves is only preserved as mineralised fragments also has implications for our understanding of the different forms used in boat buildings. So smaller vessels built on expanded log boat bases, such as waterlog boats known from Snape and Orby, they use much fewer nails than large clinker-built boats, and therefore are less likely to be either preserved or recognised in the record. Furthermore, the preservation of only nails and small wood fragments in these mineralised assemblages may mask more subtle differences in construction, for example, variations in the form of the stem or the stern of the boat. The last two biases I mentioned are quite difficult to address, and we just need to be aware of them when we form our interpretations. But the bias in use of different taxa or different species might be addressed by the fact that the whole point of boats is that they are mobile and they do not necessarily end their use life in the same place where they are built. An example of this comes from the Skultelev ships found in Roskildefjord in Denmark, some of which were built locally, one of which has been shown to have been built of oak in Ireland, and 2 have been proven to have been built in Western Norway, mostly of pine. Pine elements are also found in boats built mostly of oak in areas of oak growth, for example, Gokstad, Tuna and Åby. And furthermore, finds of boats built of oak are by no means limited to areas of native oak growth. For example, boat remains from Westness and Skar on Orkney are mostly of oak, and the Skar boat also contains pine elements, which are not native to the area in which it was found, so it could have been built elsewhere, but it's also been suggested that this component could derive from driftwood. So, with that comparative data and those biases in mind, let's move on to the Icelandic material. So, I analysed mineralised wood remains from 6 different assemblages. Some, like Vatnsdalr and Kaldrahöfði, were quite large assemblages, while others are much smaller. This isn't necessarily to do with the number of boat nails found at each site, but rather how many nails were found with mineralised wood suitable for analysis still attached. In some cases, for example at Hringsdalr, this number was quite small compared to the number of boat nails found. I should note as well here that although there are 2 boat graves at Dalvik, I've grouped them together here, as when I was working with the material, I was unfortunately unable to identify which nails resulted from which grave. But that you'll see in the taxonomic identifications in a minute that that's not really a huge problem. Another slight controversy here, though, is the site of Glumbar, where there is some debate as to whether or not it is a boat grave due to the small number of nails which are found. But when you compare Glumbar, that's F on this illustration, with the size and shape of other Icelandic boat graves, it seems to fit quite well. It's possible, on one hand, that instead of a whole boat, perhaps a symbolic portion of a boat was interred in the grave, representing a boat in the same way as the prehistoric stone ship settings mentioned earlier. It's also possible that this was a small boat built on an expanded logboat base, such as the boat from Åby in Denmark, in which case we would expect to find much fewer nails than in a fully clinker-built construction. Like other boats from... in a fully clinker-built construction, like other boats from Icelandic graves, as you can see in this illustration. For this reason, I've chosen to include it in this study, but feel free to form your own opinion on that. In terms of the wood actually found in the graves, looking at this graph, a problem is clearly visible. The black section represents fragments which could not be identified, and they form a large proportion of many of the assemblages and more than half of the fragments from Vatnsdalr. This is due to 2 problems. Firstly, the mineralisation process simply does sometimes obscure features which are essential for identification. Secondly, the remains from Vatnsdalr, Glumbar, Kaldarhöfði and Dalvik had all undergone conservation prior to their analysis. This meant that they couldn't be fractured or broken to obtain the sections that were needed for identification. In a lot of cases, it was possible to observe sufficient anatomical features on the exposed surfaces, but sadly in some cases it was not. Still, from the fragments which were identifiable, we can see a clear pattern emerging that, like in Scandinavia, oak, which is in white on this graph, and pine family wood, which is in light grey, are again the most common. In most cases, wood of the pine family was not well preserved enough to be identified to species, so it could represent pine, but could also represent spruce or larch. So a possible identification of the use of native Icelandic wood comes from the presence of birch family wood at Litlinupar and on the far right there. But this could also be alder, which is anatomically quite similar and is known from Scandinavian assemblages. A tantalising hint at the use of driftwood comes from sites of Hringsdalr and Vatnsdalr. Although I haven't included this on the graph, both assemblages included fragments which displayed characteristics typical of larch wood, and if these identifications are correct, they almost certainly represent the use of driftwood in either boat building or boat repair. So it's often simply assumed that driftwood is used in boat building, but the actual sort of references to this in historical sources are fairly rare. It's an example in Ailsaga talking about Skallagrim's land claim, where it says that Skallagrim was a great shipwright and there was no shortage of driftwood west from Mirar, which the sort of linking of these two phrases suggests that he was going to use that driftwood to make boats or ships. This is again supported by a clause in Graugash, where it says that if men row along the coast and break oars or planking, or if they damage their vessel, then they have the right to take wood from a man's shore and repair their vessel and leave any old bits lying there, as long as they announce it at the next inhabited place where they visit a house. So the fact that you can use someone else's driftwood to repair your boat would seem to indicate that you can also use your own, and that's probably something that's happening quite often. It's another example from a later historical source, Ferðabók Ólafssonar, talking about Sýrstaðavík in Melrakkasletta, where it says that there on the shore lay driftwood in big piles, and the farmers there spoke of the fact that this was enough for boat building as well as for all other household needs. So we've got a few examples here, and they're quite casual examples, which would suggest that driftwood in boat building was fairly common. So going on to the boats that we have here, what implications does this have for the boats buried in the Icelandic boat graves? Some, such as Dalvik, seem to be almost entirely made of oak, so they could either have been built abroad or they could have been made from imported timber in Iceland. The ones at Kaldarhöfði and Glumbar and Litli-Núpar are made from mixed materials. Again, they could have been built abroad and repaired with local materials in Iceland. They could have been built and repaired abroad before coming to Iceland. As I said before, Kaldarhöfði is the only example we have where potential native Icelandic wood or native Icelandic timber is being used. And like I said, the sort of twisted forms of the timbers could be quite suitable for internal components where you need a curve in the timber, such as the knees. The other examples from Vatnsdalur and Hringsdalur and their presence of conifer wood, possibly including larch, suggest two possible origins. They could be built in Western Norway, and mostly of pine, like the Skuldalev ships, or they could have been built in Iceland from driftwood, or there might well be a mix of these materials in both in each of the assemblages, and unfortunately we can't be sure of that right now. So the inclusion of boats in graves in Iceland, although it's relatively rare, is of great significance when compared to the scarcity of wood resources for boat construction and also for the significance of boats in Icelandic society. The islands of Denmark, for example, have been described as being bound together by boat, and the same could absolutely be said of the fjords of Iceland. In some areas in particular, the easiest or fastest way to travel would have been by boat, and we need to start thinking in these cases of the sea as a thoroughfare and the land as a barrier, which is quite contrary to how we typically conceptualise movement. As well as transport, boats were essential for subsistence, especially the exploitation of marine resources. They were useful for trade, and they were also useful for maintaining contact with other farms and communities. As I mentioned earlier, they're made of very valuable raw materials, wood, which is very scarce, wool, which is very valuable, and iron, which is both scarce and valuable in some cases. Furthermore, the high degree of skilled labour involved in boat repair and construction also contributes to the high value of these vessels. So in adding together the raw materials, the specialist skills, and the economic and social importance of boats, we can see that the whole is even greater than the sum of the parts. So when looking at the remains of a boat in a grave, it's almost tempting to ask, did you really bury that? The raw materials could easily be reused. The reuse of boat timber is common across the Viking world and elsewhere, and the iron rivets could also have been reforged into new objects. In comparing the scarcity of resources, especially the scarcity of wood, to the presence of boats in graves, we can see that the importance of the inclusion of a boat in the funerary rite transcends any kind of mundane economic concerns. And there may be an implication here for social status of those buried in boat graves. Unlike in Scandinavia, there is a pattern to the Icelandic boat graves in that they are all multiple inhumations, and it's been suggested that they served as mausoleums for certain groups or families, being periodically reopened to inter more individuals. The inclusion of a highly valuable object in the creation of a large funerary monument could certainly be seen as a case of conspicuous consumption during a time of prosperity, possibly linking the practice of boat burial in Iceland to wealthy or high-status groups. But this idea needs much further exploration. So, to sum up then, the patterns of utilisation of wood species in Icelandic boats from boat graves follows a similar pattern to those known in the rest of the Viking world. However, pine family wood is twice as common in the Icelandic assemblage. This could result from these boats having been built in Norway, where we know that pine was used in boat building and then brought to Iceland, or it could represent the use of driftwood in boat construction and repair in Iceland. The tentative identifications of larch at Hringstaðir and Vatnsdalur seems to indicate the latter, but in reality it's probably a mix of both hypotheses. One thing we can take away is that in order to understand the problems I've addressed here, both economic, social and ritual, we need more data. We absolutely need to continue sampling for wood remains in boat burials yet to be excavated, such as the possible find at Kunnabrekka, but it'd also be quite nice to find boat remains from non-ritual contexts. So we need to look at identifying reused timbers in wood assemblages. And we also know, for example, that boat repair at least must have taken place in Iceland. However, we have no clear evidence for boat building or repair sites. So this is something that we need to look out for in the future. So if you have any questions or comments, I would absolutely love to hear them. Otherwise, thank you all for listening.